Can I just welcome Claire Luxton, who has joined us last week, who will be taking the minutes of the meeting today and is going to be responsible for our sort of corporate governance going forward. And Malcolm, you're here. Probably everyone knows Malcolm, but Malcolm is deputising for Amanda today, I think. Thank you, Malcolm. Now, I think we have three people in the audience. I'd just like to sort of tell you who they are. I've got David Hogarth, who has a particular interest in domiciliary care. Roger Goss from Patient Concern. Is Roger here? No, he may be coming. And Robin Pike. Is Robin Pike here? Yeah, Robin is with the Hertfordshire Patients Forum. So welcome. Maybe we'll have an informal chat over coffee in between. Right. Apologies from Amanda Sherlock and from Alison Beale. I think Lucy Robbins is joining us in a minute. Any declarations of interest, Steve?
Right, yes, Steve Hitchens. I'm Vice Chair of Newland Housing Trust, whose subsidiary is a registered provider.
Thank you. And I think we won't need to have a declaration from Anna Bradley every time. Everyone knows that she's with Healthwatch, and so we know that, Anna. The minutes of...
David, can I just kind of give Louise Gussie's apologies. She became ill overnight and Alistair's deputising for her as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. The minutes of the meeting held on 7th of February. Anyone got any comments on the minutes? Thank you. Matters arising. Alice, were any matters arising you particularly wanted us to address? Okay. Right. David, your report, please.
Okay. So there's a lot in this report, Chair and colleagues. At a previous meeting, we agreed that we would contain some high-level performance information in this report. I do apologise. Chair, there's a lot in this report. We agreed at a previous meeting we would put some high-level performance information in this report. And in paragraphs 1, we've set out the progress as at the 10th of March in relation to the inspection programme. The figures are in that report and self-explanatory. Basically, the northern region, Malcolm's region, are now at the position that they've completed their inspection programme, and all judgments will be loaded on to CRM by the 25th of March. Central are on the verge of completing their programme and are confident that they will have completed it by the 31st of March, with all judgments loaded on CRM by the 7th of April. London are confident that they'll meet their programme by the 31st of March, with all judgments again loaded on CRM by the 7th of April. And there are still 800 inspections in the south to be completed. 600 of those are scheduled. That will leave 200 outstanding. A redeployment of some inspectors from Central and the North that have completed their programme to help with that programme. And a priority is now being given in the south to adult social care, independent health care and ambulance rather than dentists, because the commitment that we made around dental inspections is now discharged. So very, very good progress, I think, to the end of the year, Chair, in relation to the effort that has been put in by staff right across the Commission to get to that programme. And of that balance that's left, I think there's been some risk assessment to ensure that those high priority services are actually being seen. And those bits of the Commission which have completed the programme assisting the southern region to help them with that programme. So good progress, and that updates what's in paragraph A in the report, Chair, and brings it absolutely bang up to date as of a review meeting which took place yesterday afternoon. So I commend that work to the board.
I'd just like to add to that, 'cause I was with Malcolm and his team in Leeds yesterday, as it happens, and they're doing a terrific job, Malcolm. I thought the morale was great, the work they're doing is great, and they were, really up for it, I thought. So I really enjoyed the visit. So congratulations to you and your team. You completed your inspections the first. Yep. Well done.
Well, thank you for that, and it will give me great pleasure to take that message back to the team in the north. But it is a full team effort across the Commission, and as David said, we've now got over 70 inspectors from other regions working in the south.
Good. Thank you.
David, if I just may, I mean, I think we want to. At the appropriate time, it may be sensible to wait for the end of March. But at some point, I think the board should actually commend the efforts of the inspection teams to deliver this programme. I mean, we've had our concerns about the quality in such a rushed and dramatic sort of end of year rush, and maybe there ought to be some review of how competent we were. I don't know. That's for others to decide. But I think. Certainly praise to the staff, and also we as a board have got a responsibility to make sure we never get in this position again.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Malcolm you to give a few comments about your views on the efficacy of hospital inspections later on in the meeting. So we'll have more of a round-table discussion about that. So just to put you on warning, I will be coming back to you later. David. Okay.
No, I just wanted to endorse actually what Steve has said, that it is a tremendous effort by the staff, because it was an exceptionally tall order. And also just to again reiterate that we don't need to get into this position again. So.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you, Chair. Just on the issue about quality, all through this past few months, there have been checks and balances put in place in each region on quality, so we can bring forward further detail on how that work has continued. The commitment always was not just to deal with this numerically, but to deal with it as a qualitative exercise as well. So if we can provide the board with reassurance on that through further reports, then that's what we'll seek to do. The report continues to cover then progress on inspection reports, where we are in terms of registration. Again, I just want to pull out the good progress which has been made on primary medical services registration. It's ahead of plan and progressing well. At the 10th of February, almost 93% of providers had received their notice of decision. And that work continues, and I'm confident we'll get to discharging our responsibilities around registering primary medical services. Not just the issue about quality has been raised as a compromise on completing the programme, but there were also concerns around enforcement, and I think these figures demonstrate that enforcement activity has actually increased over this period rather than I think the fear was that it had decreased. So I hope the board takes some satisfaction from those figures. And then finally, the Customer Services Centre up in Newcastle continue to process large volumes of contacts with the Commission and ensure that they're dealt with in the appropriate way once they're received into the organisation.
Can I just ask, have we seen any upturn in the numbers of whistleblowing calls since Francis in the last sort of 2 weeks? Do you know, Chris?
There are a couple of spikes that are timed with the publication of the Francis Review, and they're consistent with when we get other media activity around whistleblowing. But actually, there's been a genuine upward trend anyway. Despite the spikes, there's been a genuine upward trend in whistleblowing calls to NCSC over the last 6 or 7 months.
Is that running around 650, 700 a month, that sort of level?
Yes, now it is. It sort of come from a sort of base of about 450 a month about 7 or 8 months ago.
Thanks.
Sorry, small quick. David talked about contacts for NCSC. The report says calls. Do we encourage email contact or other forms of contact? I mean, obviously, people write letters occasionally, still these days. And is there a programme? Because handling calls is quite intensive. And I just wondered if we're trying to develop a trend and make access easier and of higher quality to some of the computer-generated programmes, which are quite clever at not letting you go further until you've given all the details that are required. I don't know if there's any work in hand on this.
So the call centre in Newcastle, I think, is a pretty modern and sophisticated call centre, and I think was acknowledged when it was in the top 50 of the call centres in the UK, and I think that's a reflection of the fact that they've got that technology in. But to the first part of the question, Steve, we still get large volumes of letters. We get emails, and there's ability for telephone contact, email letters, and physically written letters to be received into the organisation. They're all logged and processed, and there's a tracking system which follows that through to ensure that none of these are lost as they go through the system. And the degree of accuracy, the way that the call centre operates, is very high and stands comparison with the best, and they generate data which allows them to benchmark their performance against other call centres, and they actually use that to drive their own performance and monitor their performance. So I'd hate for us to be complacent, and Tracy Forrester, who runs that centre, I think is the last person to be complacent, quite frankly, in the way that she operates. But I think it's a pretty good system. If I take some of these at pace, Chair, so I'll provide an update here on the Health Select Committee report, which we received following the previous Chair, Dame Jo Williams, and myself appearing at the committee in September. They've made a number of recommendations to us in their report, which we are considering. We had been committed to reporting back to the Select Committee by the 26th of March, and that was agreement we'd do that with the department, who were also going to report back on the 26th of March. But given the Secretary of State will make his statement to Parliament on the 26th of March about the government's initial response to Francis, and that will contain content on some of the recommendations that the Select Committee made to us. What we've agreed with the clerk to the committee is that we'll report in April, when the department also report. The Secretary of State for Health, I think, is appearing at the Select Committee on the 21st of April, so our response will coincide with that. And then that response can demonstrate how we are responding to those specific recommendations from Francis that the government are intending to take forward. So the work is to hand, it's all been done, but we await the government response, and then we can be more definitive in our response to the Select Committee, and we'll send that in alongside the Department of Health's response. There is an interrelationship and interdependence between the policy context that is being set for regulation, the department, and the work that we need to do to take it forward, and that's what we'll try and bring forward.
Yeah.
It's particularly on the response to the Health Select Committee report, and I'm mindful that the committee said that CQC must reform its culture, and I think it's common knowledge that it's known that that was directly related to my treatment, and as such I would value providing some input into the response on that issue. And I think it's also important for me to put on record that I don't feel it has been addressed as yet. It's not the place to go into the details, but I think it is an important issue that we need to address as an organisation.
Well, Chair, the culture of the organisation is a huge priority for me, and I'm determined that we'll change that, and I do believe I've begun to make changes which are about improving the culture. I'll present later in this report the pulse survey that we conducted, which is reported, which I think demonstrates that there is progress being made, but yeah,
I'd like to add to that, David. I mean, I've been around, I've met quite a lot of people around the organisation now, and I think there is a huge amount of goodwill for the organisation and for the changes that we want. And I think the communications that you're having weekly, that you send out to people, are actually read. I mean, in my experience, that's pretty unusual, frankly. And I think the colloquial way that you do it has gone down really well. So I think, I'd like to just pay tribute to the changes that you brought about since you've been here, David.
I would just like to clarify that I agree that David has made a positive impact on the culture, and I'm very pleased that staff are feel more engaged and there's better morale. I was particularly relating it to my situation, which is particularly the context of the recommendation in the Health Select Committee report. So just to be quite clear on that.
Sorry, I don't want to prolong this conversation, but I kind of feel I need to understand what the context means, because I mean I think instinctive thought is that the context must be the culture of the board, because that's the place where you as a board member are operating fundamentally, and if you're content that the culture of the organisation is changing, then it must be the culture of the board that you're concerned with. And I think if I would like to have a spade called a spade if that is the case, and I think that then is an issue which we as a board need to be clear about in terms of what it is that you specifically think needs to change, so we can consider that, because not having been a member of the board at the time at which you felt it necessary to take the action you did means I don't know what the issue is.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely support that. And as far back as December 2011, I made it very clear that I would like some kind of facilitated dialogue or mediation to actually, so I could explain the situation and we could have a sort of dialogue. And indeed, that was supposed to happen and hasn't happened. So I suspect that is actually goes to the heart of the fact that the situation is continuing, because that forum hasn't been provided. But I mean, I'd really, really welcome it.
Only to say that I do feel as a member of the board that whatever it is that we need to do in order to put this thing to this feeling to rest, I feel we need to do, because as a board member who has, you know, it sort of post-dates the original situation, I want to have the confidence that as a board we are able to work together without this being an ongoing issue.
As you know, I think we are making a number of new appointments to the board in April, hopefully 5 new appointments to the board. I think when we've got those new appointments to come in, I think the board will change so fundamentally at that time. I think we should plan to have that meeting probably in May or June. Okay.
Thanks, Chair. These things are all of a piece. Next item is in relation to the Mid-Staffordshire Public Enquiry Report. We set out that there were 38 recommendations by Robert Francis in relation to CQC where we need to lead. There's another 75 recommendations that he made where we need to make a contribution to taking forward one of those recommendations. And the Prime Minister, in his statement to Parliament on the day that Robert Francis published his report, made the announcement of the creation of the Chief Inspector of Hospitals role, which we are making progress on. We are working on including Robert Francis's recommendations in our business plan, so we can operationalise how we take forward those recommendations through 2013-2014, and we'll consider that later this morning, Chair. Additionally, as I've already indicated, the Secretary of State will make a statement to Parliament on the 26th of March about the government's initial response to Robert Francis's recommendations. A number of those initial responses will cover some of our responsibilities. The appointment of a Chief Inspector, for instance. There'll be further information around the relationship with Monitor. There will be further recommendations around a distress and failure regime which will require CQC engagement. Government are also determining their final position in relation to issues such as the transfer of HSE powers to CQC or otherwise, and they'll all be laid out in the initial response. There are a number of elements of the initial response, though, which are subject to independent reviews. Camilla Cavendish, Don Berwick, etc. are all carrying out reviews, and they're not likely to report until the summer. May, June, July, I think, are the dates which are set. And the Secretary of State's intention is to make a further report to Parliament beyond the initial response in the October of this year, which will pick up the recommendations which will come from those further reviews. So I think what we've got is a response to Francis which will take place in phases or waves, and I think the issue for CQC is to be clear about those phases and waves and respond in a timely way to each one as we move forward. So we've been trying to leave some space in our business plan for next year so we can accommodate to those changes as they're being determined. So it'll mean that we will need that flexibility as we go through the year. That leads me to the strategy document, which we will publish in April alongside the business plan. We'll also publish the outcome of the consultation on the strategy, which took place from September to December, and this will set out our high-level objectives for a 3-year period and a clear statement of purpose, which goes back to the Select Committee challenge to us about whether we were sufficiently and unambiguously clear about our purpose. This document will make a very clear statement that our job is to focus on the quality and safety of services and ensure that people are safe and receive services which are of a high quality. So again, this will inform our report back to the Select Committee. Moving on to Grant Thornton, their report is under production. I previously reported to the board that I'd hope that that report will be available to us the end of February. That timeline was subject to the availability of key individuals for interview. That wasn't possible within that time window. There are also some further interviews which have taken place this week, and in light of the way that they've convened their findings of the report, they want a further conversation with one more individual, and that's set next week. The drafting of that report is currently underway, and Chair, you've set a board meeting on the 25th of April where the board can receive that report and consider its contents. There will be a process which allows those people that are referred to in the report to actually see the sections which comment on their contribution, and people will be allowed to see those bits as we move towards the finalisation of that report and eventually production. Aggregated assessments, this is the work that Jennifer Dixon, who's the Chief Executive of the Nuffield Trust, has been leading for the Secretary of State. We anticipate that report being completed and published by the 22nd of March, and that work will then inform the Secretary of State's statement to Parliament. I'm anticipating that there will be a desire for a rating scheme that will come through, and the way that Jennifer's taken this forward, she's run a number of open focus groups. It's been a very open and interactive process, and I think there is a desire from adult social care in particular to see the introduction of a rating scheme, and there is a desire around health to see services rated in some way, and what she will do is lay out a routes map, I think is the phrase that she's used, of how that could be introduced over a period. I've already covered the next item.
Just on that, David, sorry. Philip, do you want to comment at all on the rating, on what your perception is on the ratings assessment?
I think exactly as David said, there'll be some, I think there's a general support for the view around ratings. May well be different in health as it is to social care, and Jennifer's report, I think on Friday, will talk through that, and particularly in terms of how that would go forward. I think that'll be very important for us, because obviously then we'll need to look at how we align that with the other actions that we have around our own strategy.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
The other work which is going on in real time is the work on a single distress failure regime. I'm not sure we've quite settled the language on this appropriately, but the Prime Minister's response to Parliament to Francis was the development of a single failure regime, and he went on to say where a board can be suspended by the failure of quality as well as the failures in finance. There's active work involving ourselves with the department, with the with Monitor and with the Trust Development Authority on this. It is real live work. Philip and colleagues are actively engaged in these discussions. I think it's coming to a settlement and a good place. Part of the issue here is if there is a requirement for legislation to give shape to this function, then that will mean the Karen Support Bill, which is introduced into Parliament in May, I understand, will need to have government amendments moved in it to allow those changes to take place. So the policy design work is being carried out with some speed to ensure that if there's legislative change required, that can work its way into the bill. I've touched briefly already on the staff pulse survey. This was a sample of 25% of CQC staff. It was carried out by GfK, the independent organisation, who actually did the survey in the summer. The response rate was 81%, which I have to say is very, very high and gives some reliability to the figures. I'll not present all of them, Chair. The figures are there. What they're demonstrating is some clear movement in relation to satisfaction, positivity about looking ahead to the future, commitment to CQC, people feeling that CQC is a good place to work and being proud. Morale has improved. But the baseline of this is that there's still some very low figures which we are just not satisfactory or acceptable, and we need to do more to make progress on those figures, improving morale, confidence that we're going to manage changes effectively, confidence that we're effectively communicating throughout the organisation, and those statements from the Pulse Service really do need to influence our action plan, our business plan moving forward, particularly the issue that we've pulled out at the top of page 8, which is really about effective systems and processes which help people to do their job. I think this is really about how we use the findings of surveys like this to support staff to do the job that we're asking them to do. I think we'll provide the clarity on role and vision as we move forward with a statement of the strategy and the business plan.
Sorry, Anna. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Just on this process and the assessment of our progress with this process, and I just wonder whether we need to be clear for ourselves that actually we're going into a period of unprecedented change in an organisation, both in terms of the work that we do and the way that we do it, and the way that we structure and organise ourselves to do it, and it seems to me inevitable. All the evidence shows that when you do that, the very nature of that uncertainty, no matter how much process is documented, creates a concern in the organisation, which it just is, and we have to expect that to happen. And I wonder if there's something, just a kind of reality check on these figures. I think we should kind of expect some of this to get worse over the next period, to get better beyond. And I don't want to kind of set ourselves up to expect something that perhaps isn't realistic.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I mean, that's absolutely can't disagree with what you say, but I mean, I think the way the strategic review was done, and this predates me, so I don't take any credit for this myself, by actually involving or enabling people to be involved in that strategic review, has actually reaped a lot of benefits. I mean, certainly the inspectors and compliance managers, maybe Malcolm would like to comment in a minute on this, feel that they have been genuinely involved in that strategic review, and so they sort of own the outcome to a greater extent than would sometimes be the case. But, I mean, Malcolm, have you got a view on that?
Well, speaking really from my experience in the North, I mean, David has used the phrase engagement rather than consultation, and that's the approach that we've taken with the staff. So rather than, coming out with a set of proposals and having a very black and white discussion about them, we've set out mechanisms that over the next few months will give staff an opportunity to contribute in a positive way to the process of change. I mean, the morale in the North is high and getting higher. And it will be interesting to see whether the changes that will come over the next few months will dent that. But I think staff, in broad terms, are in good heart and looking forward.
Chris, have you got a view on this?
I think one of the key parts to the change programme is recognising the need to change. I think I take your point, Anna, about the fact that there could be some bumps along the way. I think the key thing that will drive us through the engagement that we've had, both at senior leader level and also right the way through the organisation, is getting that common purpose around the reason to change. I think we've identified that, and we're using that to drive the discussions around what we need to do. So I don't doubt there'll be bumps along the way, but I do think we're in a better place because we've got a common vision, and the common vision goes right through the organisation, doesn't just stay in one place.
Steve?
I think that's right. I also think we've got a responsibility at this level, so we're preparing our business plan and how we're going to take it forward. I think with so many different factors buffeting us at the moment, and, well, not buffeting, influencing us, possibly, I should say, such as the Francis report. I think we've got to be very, very clear with staff that our purpose is fixed, because if we appear to be changing our mind and chopping and changing, that uncertainty will grow. So I think it's, we will be discussing the business plan at some point. I think it's really important that it's clear, we think it through, and we stick to it, and make sure people know in the organisation from top to bottom that we're intent on delivering it. I think that gives the confidence that it, is difficult to capture.
Okay, thanks. David?
My ambition, there's some organisations that have managed large-scale change that have managed to keep their engagement scores high, and I think we should be ambitious to do that, and I think you're right to put the reality check in, because as Chris said, there will be bumps along the way. But it is possible to actually lead change programmes where engagement stays high, and that's my ambition. Pride comes before a fall, but that if we don't set out to do that, we'll never do it. And I think we should be hungry to make sure that that's what we can do. This might be in danger of being overshadowed, but there's been some good and interesting work done with the Fertilisation and Embryology Authority about removing some duplication of where they look at laboratories and we look at laboratories, and we're wanting to remove that duplication between Fertilisation and Embryology Authority and ourselves, and we just set out the work that is being put in place to allow that to happen. The Information Governance Committee goes live on the 1st of April, and I just set out the progress chair in relation to establishing the committee and making sure that we can discharge that responsibility that we were given about the governance of how people's personal information is being maintained across the system, and the responsibilities we were given. We're currently consulting on a publication of warning notices, and the issue here is that there's been a legal view that warning notices are challengeable, and we've needed to work out how we can develop a system that allows us to publish warning notices in good and real time in the interest of people using services, so they can be clear when they're selecting a service what the implications are, with that issue about any judgments we make should be challengeable within the legal principles of challenge. So we're currently out for consultation on how we will bring those two processes together in a way that makes sense. At item 12, I'm just advising that I received a letter from the department on behalf of the Secretary of State requiring that I become the qualified person in relation to Section 36 of the Freedom of Information Act. These are the person that makes the decisions in relation to exemptions of that. And then lastly, Chair.
Is this just the fact that a change of name, or is this something different from the CQC? Because I guess what I would be concerned about is the governance around that, because obviously we need to be open and transparent as a public body, and so I guess I want to know whether there's sort of implications for this on that, and whether there needs to be a sort of clear governance process around it.
So as I understand this, as I understand this, Chair, the Act provides for the ability for a decision to be made where information is not disclosed if, in the opinion of the qualified person, disclosure would either inhibit the free or frank provision of advice or exchange of views, or would otherwise prejudice the effective conduct of public affairs. That qualified person to date has been the Secretary of State. I think what the letter effectively does is say, in respect of that judgment decision in relation to CQC, that's a decision that's delegated through the letter that I've received to me. My guess is that other arm's length bodies and public bodies would have received similar letters.
Chair, I read this and I wasn't quite sure whether I understood it or I didn't understand it. It was all in plain English, but I wasn't really sure at all what the consequences, what the effect of it is, in the past, confidential material has usually been described in the Act or the regulations by certain classes of information. Now, this seems to be an ability to designate material as exempt from disclosure in circumstances other than it fitting a particular class of information or document. And I wonder whether there are any guidelines about how and where this is used, and whether there is any record of subsequently of it being used, because it's the sort of it's the sort of provision which arouses anxiety if it isn't explained carefully what is happening. And I'm concerned that we shouldn't have a situation where anxiety about secret decision making is being fostered in a way which is actually completely unnecessary.
So Chair, what we'll do is we'll bring back a more detailed paper which will cover those issues to a future board meeting and just set that out. I think it's designed to cover the situations where there may well be a broad-ranging discussion where the unthinkable is thought, and certainly within government, if you go back to the issues about declaration of risk registers and whether that would inhibit a free exchange of views and advice being given, I think it's there to cover those kind of situations rather than actually lead to covert decision making. But let's set that out in a paper, Chair, and then try and remove that anxiety and introduce clarity.
Anna?
Just to say, I think worth saying that actually there is although there are these questions about transparency in the way that you might use this power, I think there's something very strongly to be welcomed in us being given this power rather than having it sit with the Secretary of State, which opens these decisions to political decision making as opposed to potentially or to political influence, whereas I think we should be clearly making it in the public interest in terms of the responsibilities that we have. And I think that must be a good thing across the system. So I wouldn't want to lose sight of the benefits. Then we have to make sure we use it responsibly.
Okay, thanks, Anna. That's a good point, yeah. David.
And then lastly, Chair, I'm just drawing out the fact that Castlebeck Care Group has gone into administration at the beginning of March. I just, last item, drawing out that Castlebeck Group has gone into administration at the beginning of March. The issue from our point of view with this is continuity of care and the continuity of the quality of care while the administrators make provision for the transfer or the sale of these services to other providers. There's been a long history of this trying to be secured as a group and sold as an entity. I think this is now flagging that that's not possible, and the administrators will actually take this forward. As I say, the key issue from our point of view is the continuity of care for individuals and the quality of care. But we stand ready to actually deal with that once these services are in other new ownership. There'll be some registration requirements that we'll need to put in place for the transfer of ownership and responsibility for that. But I thought it was important just to draw that to the board's attention. Thank you, Chair.
Anna?
One more. You say in this last paragraph, David, that the 16 active locations are being monitored, and you say also that 7 of them don't have registered managers. So there's clearly a degree of not insignificant risk, at least potentially here. What does monitored mean? What are we actually doing?
So monitor will mean anything from this frequent contact at a national level with the current managers of Castlebeck. I've had a number of conversations and correspondence with. We've got a provider manager that has that. It means that I've had a number of conversations with the person who's currently responsible for the group. The provider manager has conversations with them, and at a local level, inspectors are in contact with the individual homes to ensure that there is appropriate staffing, leadership, etc. in place. And I think what we're flagging here, Anna, is that we're more vigilant than we would otherwise be. These homes have maintained standards over the past period rather than have declined in standards, but of course this is a bigger threat and risk to staff morale and security, etc., than might otherwise have been the case if they'd have transferred or maintained in one group. So monitoring is, it can be anything from telephone calls to check how things are, to actually unannounced inspections and turning up to check how quality has been maintained. The other thing I'd say is that I think it's also for commissioners to continue to monitor the quality and safety, and it's also for Castle Bet to continue to provide that appropriate care. And I think we need to hold the ring on making sure that others do their jobs as well as that we're actually checking the standards of quality and safety.
Okay, thanks, David, very much. Just to add just one thing. We've invited Robert Francis to come to a meeting in June or July, so we can have a full discussion about the Francis report at that time. And then I'm just conscious that there is a lot going on, and if non-execs feel that that there's too much going on and they're not fully up to speed, I mean, I'd just encourage you to have informal chats with me in between board meetings. Okay, thank you very much, David. John, finance report.
Thank you, Chair. In the papers, the board have got a brief finance report. The report that you've got in front of you is up to the end of January and sets out the position up to the end of January together with the financial forecast for the full year. The position at the end of January, as you see, is still an underspend. However, we've now got the February figures and we're working through with auditors on the year-end numbers and some provisions going in March. So the forecast, I think, is fairly accurate. There will be additional provisions to put in March, but we're seeing that in February the underspend was reduced by a further $1 million on staff costs and a further $500,000 on non-staff costs. So that is the reason for that really is because of the increased spend on bank inspectors to deliver the year-end programme. And we're going to see a similar position in March with an overspend on the budget in March, similar nature, about $1 million on staff costs and another $500,000 on non-staff costs. So the financial forecast for the full year anticipate to be in or around the on or around the figures that you see here, about a 1.3 million underspend on total revenue costs. The report sets out some of the main variances. There's nothing particularly material that I really want to draw the board's attention to. There will be other additional provisions to go in March around legal costs, some additional consultancy costs that we're incurring through February and March, but if anything, the full year forecast will be closer to budget than what you're seeing here in this report. On page 3 of the report, we set out some of the variances on non-staff costs. Again, most of the adverse variances relate to the additional staff and bank staff that we've brought in the second half of the year. The costs have been ramping up as we get nearer the year end. There may be additional potential redundancy provisions that we're working through with HR at the moment, and some additional consultancy costs that need to go in March. The favourable variance on depreciation arises really as a result of some of the actions taken at the end of last year. We're working through that with the auditors at the moment. That variance, the forecast variance of 3.2, may reduce as we finalise the year-end figures in preparation for the year-end accounts. There is a slight favourable variance on income, nothing particularly material. Our fee income is more or less on budget as we set out at the beginning of the year, so I don't anticipate any particular surprises here as we close out the accounts at the end of March. Just moving on, the capital expenditure again is will be very close to budget, just a slight underspend on our capital budget of 11 million in the year, mainly because some of the projects I think were just a little bit slow to start during the year, but by and large we finished most of the big projects. The Tranche 5 registration project, which took up quite a bit of the capital spend, is complete and is more or less on budget for the year. So a slight underspend anticipated on capital on a full year basis. On page 4 again, I've put in just a very short summary on Healthwatch. Again, The Healthwatch budget will be slightly underspent in the year, again because of the slow start in getting Healthwatch up and running after the 1st of October. I think we're seeing Healthwatch costs increase as we go forward, and the budget for 13-14, I suspect, will be fully spent on a full year basis. Cash flow on page 4 again. Our total grant in aid will be slightly underspent in the year. We had an allocation of 60 million on revenue grant and aid and 12 million on capital. That will be underspent in accordance with some of the shortfalls that I've just previously mentioned. So all in all, given that we were well below the budget in the first half year, we're seeing a lot of catch-up in the period from October to March. Again, mainly because of the bank inspectors bringing in additional staff to deliver the programme, and we're just going to see a small shortfall then on a full year basis. Our interim audit has commenced. The auditors are going through the interim audit at the moment. I have a further meeting with the Department of Health this Friday to discuss the way forward on 13-14, and we will be taking account of some of the issues that weren't identified when we had the initial budget allocation back in October, November time. And I'll update the board fully on that in April. So if anyone has any questions on any of the numbers, I don't think there's anything particularly material that needs to be addressed in terms of our financial outturn. It will be very much in line with our original budget.
Thanks, John. Any questions for John? Good. That's always a good sign, John. Thanks very much. Risk register. Now, Louise is not here, so Alistair, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The work has been ongoing to revise and bring back to the board a strategic set of risks that align to the strategy of the organisation. And this, given that the strategy itself is yet to be signed off, remains a work in progress. But as I hope you can see from the work that's been done and the annex to this paper, the aim is to group the risks around the 6 strategic shifts. And of course, the way the risks have been phrased and worded draws from all the work that went on over the last 12 months with the board in their thinking about what strategic risks should feel and look like, the approximate number, and how we should set that out in terms of a format. So there has been a bit of revision of this since you've seen it at last time, but it hasn't markedly changed in terms of the words. We are in a position where we need to do further work on this once the strategy has been finalised. And you would expect that below this there will sit, and there are, a wide range of corporate delivery risks which are fleshed out also with owners and mitigations. And the whole process of risk management is reviewed and overseen by the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, and I'm sure John might have some words to say about what went on at the ARAC meeting yesterday, which had a session focused on risk. The issue that the board will have to come back to at some point is what its risk appetite is around all these risks. If you have a look at the annex itself, the risk tolerance in all of these risks is low, and that is something the board itself has to keep under review, as does its satisfaction or otherwise with what the current risk score is, whether the mitigations are working and whether or not there's more or less that needs to be done in relation to each of those. So at this stage, the board's invited to accept the register and approve it for what it is, recognising that it's a work in progress. But of course, any comments that you have would be extremely welcome and will feed into the next iteration.
Any comments to Alistair? John?
David, would it be helpful if I just added my recommendation to the board to accept this? As Alistair correctly pointed out, the adoption of the strategic plan, the new strategic plan, when that happens in a few weeks' time, will lead to a further review of the risk register. And the ARAC committee is planning a workshop in the summer where that takes place, with the further report to the board to enable you to approve a revised risk register stemming from the new strategic plan. So I think the best thing to do is to accept this report now, and we'll come back to it later in the summer.
Yeah, I mean, surely the heart of this is, our failure or potential failure not to identify another systemic collapse in care quality standards in a hospital or a care home. And the trouble is, the trouble with these risk registers is that we've been signing this risk register, no doubt, in the CQC for the last 4 or 5 years, actually not being able to answer that question. I mean, that is, it seems to me, the heart of why we're here. And I don't think we've been in a position, in a sense, to give that assurance to the public for a long, long time. And yet we still happily sign off risk registers. And I mean, I think this is true with so many organisations, that you don't see the elephant in the room.
Well, I'm sure John might say as well that you might be reassured by the work that was done yesterday, which was focusing entirely, well, not entirely, but very much in the time that we spent on that very issue, and then thinking through what the nature of the mitigations would need to be and look like in order to provide the board and the chief executive with the right sort of assurances and the information that we were required to do that. And I think we probably spent about 90% of the time on that yesterday. So that is exactly the focus of not simply writing the words on a bit of paper, but what are the mitigations necessary to be put in place in terms of capability, capacity, and culture, in order then to bring some assurance that these things
Yeah,
are
I think
managed.
the point I'd like to just to pursue that a little bit further is that this is such a fundamental issue to what the whole purpose of CQC is. I mean, if we can't assure ourselves of that, then what is the point of this, is what I would say. So, I mean, you can delegate this to some extent to the ARAC to do some ferreting around, but actually, we have got to be, when we finish a strategic review and we put in place the changes, the acid test is, frankly, could a mid-staffs, a Morecambe Bay, a Winterbourne View happen again? Or it may happen again, but it's much less likely to happen again than it has in the past. I mean, there will always be a residual risk around that area, but we have got to get a lot more comfortable with knowing what that risk is and what we're doing to reduce that risk down to an absolute fraction, because so long as we don't know, I think people can stand back and say, well, what is the point of
David, I think we're very clear about the risk, and we, as Alistair has said, Steve and I and other members of the ARAC committee and David Behan spent a significant part of yesterday afternoon exploring this issue in preparation for the workshop in the summer. There are two issues there. The first issue is identifying the risk. The second issue is putting in place the mitigating actions in order to reduce the risk. And it is the putting in place the mitigating actions which I think has been the real challenge for the Commission. Work has been starting some time ago, and on particular areas of development, and David has been taking that forward very thoroughly over the last 6-9 months, with much of that coming to fruition in the new strategic plan which we're talking about. But we still need to be able to develop those mitigating actions and put in place the capacity to make sure that the circumstances you describe do not arise again.
Yeah, I just think we shouldn't take any false comfort from the fact that we've got a bloody risk register. I mean, Anna then Kay.
I mean, I take that point entirely. I want to address, though, the primary question that you ask about how we assure ourselves that we're in the best possible position to identify these potential failures of the system. And it seems to me that there's two answers to this. One is that we are putting in place a strategic change process with associated business plan, which we believe in the medium to long term will get us to a place where we're better. We can give that assurance. Now, the test will be whether or not, when we get there, it does the trick. But I think there's another thing, and this is the more immediate and really quite troubles me, which is that there is a real change risk, which is not identified in here, which is that actually, as we're putting in place the plans for the medium to longer term, we drop a ball. to use that awful phrase, and that really does concern me. And I think there's a sense in which we need to have something very much at the forefront of our sense of what the risks are for the organisation, which is associated with the fact that we are undergoing this very huge change, and we do need to have probably some ad hoc and more temporary but very focused mitigations in place to give ourselves that assurance on a regular and routine basis, rather than feeling that it's built into the system. So I think there's something kind of interim, and that's not here on the risk register, which is much more about the longer term process.
We'll go to Kay then, and then to Steve. I mean, that's a point that's well made. I think we should come back to the board next time and spell out what we're going to do in this transitional period. So can we just go to Kay and then to... Because, let's not lose that point. Kay.
I would like to strongly recommend that we boost our expertise and capacity in risk assessment and risk management. This is an issue that I've raised many times and was really fundamental to the fact that I went to the public inquiry. And I think if we are going to get to grips with it, we do need to make sure we've got the expertise in the organisation, because I think that will be a major stumbling block if we don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Steve?
So Anna's point is well made, and we questioned the Chief Executive on this very point yesterday at ARAC, and he gave a comprehensive and the perfect answer. He said it's got to all be in the business plan. So I understand the need for ad hoc arrangements, but David, I think, is really right that it's got to be in the business plan. We've got to know where we're going. We've got to have that sense of direction, and that sense of change is going to happen. I think we've got to be vigilant as a board. That's our role. But I think having a document that we've signed off that is then at the heart of where we're going over the next 1 year and 3 year period is the key to delivering this in a strategic manner.
I'm going to just ask Nick. I mean, you're very much involved with the work that is going on, looking at intelligence at the moment. I mean, have you got any? Do you want to make any sort of preliminary observations as to where that's taking us?
I think the work that's going on at the moment is really testing and questioning the way that we've looked at data and intelligence in the past. I think the broad question here about managing the risk, I think I go along with the points about that tying in with the business plan. These things have got to be joined up. And I think the work that's currently underway will ensure that the intelligence, the analysis, the business processes and the business objectives are actually joined in a virtuous cycle of activity.
I think just going back to Kay's point, though, what I think we might do, I'm just thinking we're probably 2 months away from doing this, give a presentation to the board about the predictive metrics that we're developing at the moment, and how that joined up with the inspections can give us greater assurance that we are able to spot the failing hospital, the failing care home earlier than we have in the past. So should we... I'm guessing, where are we now? We're in April. Maybe plan to do that in June? In March. Okay, maybe try and do that in May or June. Yeah. Anna, do you have another point?
Well, I don't know what all the answers are, but I just think there might be something to be taken away, which is... I'm going to take the points entirely about the strategic change process and the business plan. I mean, this is, I would be an enormously strong advocate for that, but I just, and I am, and I think we should do all of that. But I also don't think we can expect our chair and chief exec to go to a health select committee in 6 months and say we're implementing a business strategy and business plan. I think we have to be able to say that we've had our eyes and the ears in an appropriate fashion over managing the risk in the interim as well, in a really kind of focused way. And there's something about giving ourselves that assurance. And maybe it's a small little programme of work which might include what you suggest, David, but something else which is just focused on that question for the next 6 months or so.
David?
I think this is a hugely important conversation, David, if I may say. And so when the business plan is brought forward for publication, what we'll do is we'll sit the strategic risk register as part of that business plan. And I think, Anna, you're absolutely right about we have a programme which will change over effectively a 2-year period. And whilst we're changing that over that 2-year period, we need to calculate what the risk of change is as well. and that needs to be factored into the business plan. So we are thinking about and bringing forward proposals about what capacity we need to manage change, as well as what additional capacity we need to think through the changes that Nick referred to. I think the key issue here, David, and you've identified this previously, is as well as what Nick has said about what is the model, and QRP has a lot of very, very strong things in its favour. It is a model that is there to predict risk. My concern would be how connected are operational decisions about risk and priorities to that intelligence. And I think that's too disconnected at the minute, and it needs to be more connected. There's also, post-Francis, work being taken forward by the Commissioning Board. I didn't mention it in my report, but could have done, is the work that Mike Farrer's been asked to look at in terms of data burdens. And I think the issue there is a conversation about the relevance of data rather than the volume of data. Because I think there's information that we need that isn't yet collected, that we need to start putting in place a process to collect. And that's right across the system, not just for CQC, I think. So I think there's some really important work. And David, we'll pick that out. I think your suggestion of a presentation, once the McKinsey's work is coming to some conclusions, is a really good one to actually share what that thinking has been, and we'll make arrangements to bring that. I think May will be a good time to do it, quite frankly, rather than push it into June. So let's try and just lock that down, and we'll make some arrangements.
But I think it's just so the board are under no illusions. We should not take comfort from the fact that we are inspecting hospitals in the way we inspect them at the moment, because the inspections are far too shallow and just not deep enough to really get under the skin of a big hospital. So, I mean, that's the real risk that I feel that we have at the moment, is that we simply don't have the methodology to really get to understand what is happening in these big hospitals, well, any hospitals. But we'll come back to you in a couple of months' time to say how we think we can do that, though, because it can be done. Says I. Okay, well, that's good. Thank you very much for that. Anna, I think we're going to have a quick Healthwatch. Or have I missed something out? No, Healthwatch. I think we'd always like to have just a 5-minute, 2-minute, whatever you want to do, just how it's going, really.
So what I've sent the board is a very short presentation about the priorities we're proposing to address. Sorry, thank you. What I've sent is a very short presentation about the priorities that Healthwatch are proposing to address in the next period. And I've done that deliberately because we have been explicit about a commitment to consulting with the CQC board as well as with others about our priorities. I have to say that the kind of timescale for the setup of Healthwatch means that we're doing this in a rather pragmatic way. So we've held a number of roundtable events and discussions. We've had some with stakeholders. We've had some regional events with Emerging Local Healthwatch, 5 of them. And taken thoughts from a fairly significant number of people, but at a fairly high level. So this hasn't been a kind of formal consultative process, but it has been an engagement process. And this is an important part of that for us, to make sure that the CQC can see how this would fit with what it is also doing. There'll be also a discussion with the Department of Health about our proposals for our business plan. I mean, to cut to the very end of this proposal, this paper, you'll see under the heading of these pages aren't numbered, as always. So under the heading of Establishing Healthwatch England as an effective organisation, which is the 4th of our priority areas, that one of the things we propose to do is develop a strategy for Healthwatch England with a longer-term plan, and that will happen during the course of this year. So this is a pragmatic exercise at this juncture. Just to speak to the priorities that we've identified, very briefly, and then invite comments. We've had quite a conversation at the committee about what I would call consumer rights. There are a set of 8 consumer rights which are find their genesis in a speech made by John F. Kennedy in 1963. Not a bad genesis, I always think. Which we think we want to focus our work on and our contribution to discussions in health and social care. Partly because we believe that one of the deficits, if you like, in thinking about the consumer, patient, user, carer interest is that it has not been a conversation about rights. It's been a conversation where we as consumers have been grateful for what we've had or got, and very often we're right to be grateful, but where we haven't felt able to speak up in the way that perhaps we would in other consumer environments. So a conversation about rights seems to be quite helpful to the shift that we need to see in health and social care. So I'm now making no apology for talking about consumers, and I want to appeal to the consumer rights. And what you see in terms of these priorities at the top are 2 of those 8 rights. So the right to be heard and the right to redress. And we've picked these 2 up. I mean, clearly we can't achieve both of these things in a short space of a year. These are kind of longer term ambitions. But we've picked these 2 things particularly because the right to be heard is very central to the whole conversation and the whole set of changes in health and social care. There's a moment here where everyone is thinking about how do we properly take account of consumer views and interests in the decisions that we make, whether that's about individual care or it's about big policy decisions at the national level. And part of our role at Healthwatch England is to help the system think about how to do that and to challenge it to do it well. Not to do it for them, but to challenge them to do it well. So that's really what that objective is about. The second one is about the right to redress. I mean, the first one has a real resonance in Francis, of course. The second one also real resonance in Francis. This is about complaints and concerns and the importance of not just having systems which collate, report and respond, but actually making sure that the whole of the system sees concerns and complaints as the valuable source of intelligence and information for improvement, which other sectors, frankly, already see the benefits in. So there's quite a shift here, and I think one of the things there is of course a complaints review, which is part of the response to Francis. It's one of the things that Anne Clewett is doing. It's very much focused on hospitals. I think one of the things that we're concerned about is the joins. As a user of health and social care services with a more complex set of needs, actually finding the right place to go to make your complaint and making sure you're not passed from one section to another and that the system responds as a whole in a way which is fit for purpose, I think is a real challenge. Add to which, of course, while we know something about hospital complaints, I think we know extremely little about primary health care, and social care is a different system again. So there's something about the whole system, and that will be important for Healthwatch always. It's starting with the person, not with the system. So that kind of integrated sense of complaints will be central to this. The third is obviously about local Healthwatch, being our major preoccupation until now. We've done lots of work, continue to do lots of work to support local Healthwatch. As I've reported at the board before, I think local Healthwatch will be commissioned to a very great extent by the 1st of April, but not all of them will have had time to mobilise and get themselves up to speed to deliver full service for another 6 months or so at least. So this is a work in progress, at least for some. Others have been in shadow form for at least a year, and they're very well developed, and they will show the way and will help to give them the opportunities to share that good practice at every point on over the next period. But we've been very focused on delivering a package of things which will get local Healthwatch up to speed, and we need to continue to do that during the course of the next year. There's a real demand from local Healthwatch for us to take that role and to help them work out what good looks like as a local Healthwatch. And then, as I say, the final thing is about the final stages of our own development. We have still got a fairly significant number of people in interim posts. They're doing a great job for us, and they've been with us for a while, but we're going to have to move to full staffing ourselves, and we have a lot of work to do over the next period. So as my Chief Exec keep saying we're sailing the ship and building it simultaneously, as our local Healthwatch. And I should say, in relation to Catherine, that I would have wanted her to be here to present this, actually, because I think this is about what we're going to be doing, and it would be for her to be here and do that, but she couldn't make this particular meeting. I hope she'll come to a future one. And that's really all I want to say, David, but I'll take questions.
I mean, if Catherine could come for the next meeting, that would be great, I think.
Yeah.
You couldn't send me those JFK 8
Off the
things,
top of my head.
No, just send it to me in paper.
Of course I
Do you
can.
mind?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
I really like that, from Camelot to CQC.
Yeah.
It's got a nice ring about it, hasn't it?
Yes.
Look, Anna, well, just one thing. The fundamental standards that Francis was talking about, which he developed actually in the evidence he gave to the Select Committee after he did his report, is something that we want to sort of really get a grip of and do a lot of consultation with, because he very much said to get traction on these fundamental standards, you've got to get a lot of involvement from patients and the public. And I just wonder whether we couldn't pick that up with you and Catherine outside this meeting, because we've had a first sort of cockshy at what they might look like, but start kicking that around with you.
Be delighted to do that, David, and but I think I can almost guarantee that one of our first responses is going to be about the need to really engage with wider groups of consumers in order to kind of test those.
But you might be a good way
but
of
we will
doing
love
that,
to stop that process.
Get it going.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, it's good to see Healthwatch sort of getting off the ground. I mean, as you say, the sort of consumer model is quite new to health and social care, and I suspect that there may be some sort of resistance to that. It's quite potentially a political issue, and I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but there is likely to be some resistance, and so it'd be interesting just to hear, whether there's a sort of communication job to be done, or I don't know, but I just wondered if you'd considered that. I also, on the right to redress, and you may not be able to answer that now, I mean, had you had any thoughts about what that actually might mean? Because in other areas it can mean sort of getting some compensation or getting, some way to sort of compensate what's happened. So I'm not entirely sure what that could mean in health and social care. And then the final thing is, it's a request actually. I know in the presentation you've mentioned vulnerable groups, and sometimes if you talk about vulnerable groups, it potentially sets people apart. And I wondered if it would be possible to say people in vulnerable situations, the thinking being that it's the situations that cause people to be vulnerable rather than being part of a group, and it kind of changes the emphasis. So, but obviously that's very much my own little hobby horse.
Were there any other questions for Anna, Chris?
Not so much a question, more I'm really welcome the use of consumer views in what you're talking about there. And I think there's two really important points for me. One is in the development of local Healthwatch. One of the reasons to gather user views is to drive change, to drive improvement in those services. And I think there's some really important work we need to do around the development of our intelligence model, so that the information that you gather is helpful to that change. I think that's a really important point. And I certainly, I really welcome the idea of publishing the annual report with the voice of the consumer at its heart. And I think there's something we think talked about this before in terms of the link between this and the State of Care report. And I think there's an important correlation that we need to try and address. But I really welcome the views there.
Okay, Alistair, yeah.
I just wondered, I mean, there's the mention in the tracking of the recommendations in Francis, and I was just wondering whether Healthwatch was planning to publish its own separate response to Francis in any way, shape or form, and how that might be shared with the board.
Okay, Anna.
Okay, well, I'll start backwards. So, response to Francis, yes, we are planning to publish our own response to Francis. It won't be covering 290 recommendations. But we do plan to publish something, and we are explicitly not going to be part of the government response to Francis, and that's an in-principle decision which I believe to be important, which is that I think although we are part of the statutory arrangement, it's very important that we retain that sense of our independence to speak to the system and to the government, and so we are doing something slightly separate around the same time frame. I see no reason why we shouldn't share with the board in confidence until it's published what we're proposing to say. I wouldn't wish there to be any surprises. It's not quite done and dusted, but probably in the next 24 hours we could arrange to do that. Vulnerable groups or people in vulnerable situations. I mean, I think I take that away, Kay. I mean, it's a point well made. It makes me wonder whether there are both, actually. I mean, I'm not sure whether everyone who might fit into these categories is a person necessarily in a vulnerable situation, and maybe actually there's something about vulnerable groups and people in vulnerable situations. Because, but I think I take that away and think about it. I mean, this is a very shorthand version, but there's opportunity to finesse it in the final business plan. On compensation and right to redress, I mean, that might be a concern that needs to be addressed, but I think my starting point on this is what's very, very clearly documented in all the research which has been done with consumers actually in any sector, which is that what people want more than anything else is to know that it's not going to happen again to someone else. They want the benefit of their experience to be someone else doesn't have the same experience. And actually it's rarely that compensation is their primary motivation for complaining. And you know, what a great thing that is, because it means people are complaining for the benefit of the system. And I think we should absolutely embrace that. There are occasions, I think they're probably reasonably well addressed, or there is the opportunity to address them, where compensation is the right answer. I think this is much more about getting concerns and complaints. Our primary purpose here, getting concerns and complaints into the system, so that and getting the system to take note. Your first point about resistance to the consumer agenda. Yeah, I've been very mindful of this in the time that I've been the chair of Healthwatch England, and for months and months as the chair of Healthwatch, every time I spoke, every time I've mentioned any person who might use services, I've talked about in the same mouthful: consumers, users, patients, carers, families and friends. It's such a mouthful by the time you get to the end. And the fact is that most people have, there is lots of different variants on the theme of what is the right way to talk about people. I think we need to be sensitive to that. We certainly try to be in the conversations that we've had with people, but I think as time has passed, I'm becoming a bit more robust about the sense that I think there's an advantage in thinking about this through the consumer rights agenda, partly because I think there is a readiness for a change of mindset, really. So it may not be the term for the future always, but it's not a bad term for now. I would want to argue that case a little. So, but there will certainly be a need to communicate about it and to discuss it with people, and for us to make the case. And I think one of the things that we will want to do as part of our kind of setup work is a piece which we will want to share publicly on what it is to be a consumer champion, what that means and what it should involve and what we understand it to be. And that would be part of our communication.
Good, thanks very much, Anna. I think we'll press on. Unless people are desperate for coffee, I think we'll have coffee at 11 if that's all right. So, scheme of delegation. Alistair, are you doing this?
I am, David. Thank you very much. Wow, right. Deep breath. This is possibly not the most exciting paper that's ever come to the board, but I would submit that it's quite important. This is the last of the key governance documents that have been fundamentally reviewed over the last period of time. And this is the first fundamental review of this scheme of delegation since CQC started. And we've taken the opportunity to not merely update it, but think about it in a slightly different way, and hopefully a way that makes it a more pragmatic and a more comprehensive document. It is long. You may not believe it, but we have made every attempt to keep it as short as possible, but it is long because it has an awful lot in it, and the intention is that it is a complete document, so it contains a number of important annexes, which I'll come on to. Just recently I was thinking about it, and I think perhaps the scheme of delegation is not now the most accurate title for it. It might be better to describe it as a scheme of delegation and authority, because it's not just capturing things that have been delegated, but capturing other powers which are important. The benefit of that is it would create a slightly more palatable acronym, if we can call it the scheme of delegation and authority, though those who've been working on it might say that the acronym currently is the most descriptive. Okay, so what's different and what's important in this? Well, there's a couple of things that I'd like the board to focus on. First of all, that we've taken the opportunity to break the scheme of delegation into two parts, and the proposal is that they would be handled in future in a slightly different way to the way they've been handled in the past. In the past, the board has taken responsibility for approving any changes, any and all changes to the entire scheme, and that has meant and would mean in future that every minor change around particularly the regulatory delegations would have to come to the board for approval. In practice in the past, they've often gone to the chair for chair's action and then subsequently needed approval by the board. I don't think that is particularly a good use of the board's time. So the proposal here is that there's part one sets out very clearly what the powers reserved to the board are and what it will continue to take responsibility for and approve. And in the second part, delegates via David as the Chief Executive and Accounting Officer, makes a series of executive delegations, and the proposal would be that if you approve that changes to part two would be approved by the Chief Executive. We could of course have a system of reporting those changes to you as and when, or on whatever frequency, by whatever means you felt appropriate. The other thing that we've done, and the greatest bulk of the work has gone into looking at the regulatory delegations which are contained in this part two. Previously, I think it's true to say that the delegation had focused on looking at what our statutory responsibilities were and capturing them and writing them down, and many of them were to do with specific regulatory and statutory functions. The approach taken here has been to expand this. So what it seeks to capture are all the important and key regulatory decisions, whether or not they're captured in statute, so that there's clarity as much for individuals and the organisation about who is authorised to take what kind of regulatory decisions. And in support of that, and within the scheme of delegation, your cover paper says at page 3, it's actually at page 4, we've got a series of principles that we have used to marshal and to structure that scheme. And in essence, what we've been trying to do with these principles and in the structure of the scheme, particularly around the regulatory delegations, is strike an appropriate balance between getting decisions made at the appropriate level where it aligns with roles and responsibilities, so that as far as possible the more routine decisions are taken at a lower level. So balancing a principle of subsidiarity with ensuring that there's the mechanism for and the recognition of the need to escalate where that's appropriate. Now, some of that, it makes it very plain where escalation is required, in the sense that the delegation specifies certain decisions to be made. But of course in this there will always be a requirement for an element of judgment to be applied where there may be a novel, contentious, or a particular regulated decision which may be routine but might have considerable impact. So I invite the board to have a look at those principles and comment on them and hopefully approve them. There are a number of, in part one, there are a number of delegations which are specific and retained to the Chief Executive, and those are detailed. The way that we have structured the scheme of delegation, and this picks up particularly, David, on what you were looking for, about making it plain. So within the scheme, it structures the delegations around roles, so people can be clear around what delegations, what powers, what responsibilities they have got, rather than having to move through the scheme and piece that together. But in the annex, Annex B, it also groups them around the topic and the issue. There are 5 annexes to the scheme. The first are the financial delegations, and John, I think it's true to say a lot of these are drawn from the Department of Health and mirror the requirements that they would expect to see as the parent department. We've got, I've mentioned Annex B. Annex C is the standing financial instructions. Again, a lot of them are required by the Department of Health. And importantly, I'd like the board to focus on Annex D. Now, Annex D, this lays out the policies which is proposed. These are corporate policies that the board retains responsibility and ownership of, by which I mean that if those policies are changed or amended, they would come to the board for approval. And the implication of that, of course, is that the other policies would be signed off at the executive level. And the underlying philosophy behind how we've structured that is that anything that is strategic, that characterises the CQC as an employer, the nature of that employer, and the nature of the culture of the CQC, that should be reserved to the board. And then at Annex E, we've updated, which you'd seen before, the accountability framework. So we've updated that in line with the scheme of delegation. Now, the final thing I would say by way of introduction is that whilst there's been enormous change, there will be further changes to this perforce across the year. As we make changes organisationally or structurally, and indeed as we might make changes to the regulatory model, the creation of new roles of Chief Inspector, they will have to be, their powers and so on will have to be encompassed in this. So I'm afraid, will be coming back to you, regardless of whether you approve Part 1 and Part 2. We will be coming back to you to explain how we've restructured that in due course.
Thanks, Alistair. John.
David, I have 2 questions. The first question is, can we please not go through this page by page when you deal with it?
There's no way we're going through it page by page.
Thank you very much. And I thought that might be the answer. But secondly, more significantly, I have been in a number of meetings with you where you have expressed concern about particular decisions being delegated to the executive rather than being retained at the board. In all of those cases, I felt that your judgment was right and the previous scheme of delegation was wrong. And I would like to be reassured that you are satisfied that the level of delegation is now appropriate.
Yeah. Well, I would like to have one line in this saying something about good sense and judgment. I mean, the truth is, I don't know, John. I have not read every page on this thing, and I mean, there are 211 pages of gloop here that I have not read. So I don't know is the answer. I can't answer your question. All I know is that what you had before, which meant that really important decisions will be made at the at Malcolm's level and not coming to the board, was completely wrong. And actually, really important decisions about the fundamentals of what the CQC is about, i.e., is that hospital safe or not, were being taken away from this board. Now, I just want assurance that through all this gobbledygook here, Alistair, that actually those decisions and that responsibility is here, not down in the organisation somewhere. So the answer is,
Chair,
I don't know.
If you're not happy, I'm not prepared to vote for this today.
Well, how do I get happy? I can't get happy with this. Now, maybe I'm overreacting.
I think you need a more detailed briefing to explain the significant changes in the delegation.
It's not just me. I mean, do the other non-executive directors feel, because it may be me just being not taking the time to read it. I mean, does everyone here feel that they are happy to sign this off because they've read and understood it?
I feel not unlike you. I have an observation on this particular point, because I think this is the critical issue. I mean, I don't think we can be responsible for making all of those for making all the regulatory decisions at the board. Clearly. But one of the things that I find missing from here, so there's a couple of questions. One is about the way in which those decisions are made internally, and one of the things that troubles me slightly on my cursory reading, and it is a cursory reading but kind of looking through this document, is that an awful lot of the scheme of delegation at the operational level is about individual point responsibility for decisions, and I'm not sure I feel comfortable with leaving those decisions in the hands of individuals. It seems to me that there's something which often needs to be more corporate and collective about some of these big decisions, whatever the level. If it came to the board, it would be a collective decision, of course. So there's something I want to ask David really about at the more operational level about this kind of point responsibility as opposed to group responsibility. There's something about then for me also about the way in which we review decisions that are made on the board's behalf. And that's not in here because this is a scheme of delegation, but actually wherever significant decisions are being made about regulation, it seems to me that we need to be comfortable that they are being reviewed both within the organisation and at the appropriate level of decision at the board, so that we can assure ourselves that the right kinds of decisions are being made using the right kinds of criteria, bearing in mind we can't make them all ourselves. And then you're quite right, David, there's the question about the sort of judgment that is taken to bring some decisions to the board, regulatory decisions to the board, and I don't see that in here myself. So maybe I've missed it, but I don't see the sense that might be required on one or two occasions. And I do have this sense of kind of obfuscation by a level of detail, and it's not deliberate, but it's very difficult to see because there's so much detail. And I want to make one other slightly unrelated point, which is in relation to 2.5 in the cover paper. And I think this is about how the board has been wont to operate, and how I think one of the things I think we really need to change. So it talks here about us being the place which approves reports, and it talks about reports, and that is what happens. So we've got in our papers today a report to be approved, and I don't think a board can approve a report at 50, 80 pages, whatever it is, which is going to go to the Secretary of State or Parliament or anything else. What we can approve are a set of recommendations which we wish to make on the back of a report, and I think that is the important thing. So I mean, there's something about getting the right request to the board about what we approve, and that is a matter of judgment, and it is not about reports, it's about recommendations, it seems to me.
Mm. Steve?
I think that's right. I wouldn't want to down with even faint praise what's been done here, because it's a tremendous amount of work, and I think it's really important. And some of the stuff that we did with Deloitte's flagged up some real problems in the system of delegation. What occurs to me is that actually the changes that are going to come down the track are going to be even more significant. I mean, what powers will the Chief Inspector of Hospitals have? And I think that's going to be a really critical set of delegations. I think this is an improvement. I think it would be a mistake to kick this into the long grass. I think we should accept this as work in progress, because I think it's a step in the right direction, and it clarifies some of the issues that we've already had reports from external independent consultants. Advisors are really weak in our setup. So I'd like to say, pick up Alistair's point that this is definitely a first iteration, though we've got to find a better way of able to deal with this.
David, do you want to comment?
Okay. So I have read all 288 pages, or however many it is. I think just on the point versus group decisions, we have 44,000 inspections to do each year, and actually the system for conducting that, assuring them and checking them and signing them off is effectively what we're trying to capture here, and that's why it's detailed by role as distinct by function. I think the issue then is what is the challenge that's in the system, and each region has a committee which is about challenging to ensure we can get consistency of decisions. So I draw a distinction between, I think you were making this yourself, Anna, between the monitoring and the actual taking of decisions. And as we try and delay the bureaucracy of this organisation, there's a balance to be struck here, and I don't know what the perfect balance is, if I'm being brutally honest with you. And this is an attempt just to set it out clearly and unambiguously of what that is. I think the issue then is how do we report those decisions to the board, and that, I think, means a change from our standard reporting of all these KPIs that have been produced historically, so it reflects more on the decisions that are being made rather than just numbers which come forward. And I don't, again, down with faint praise the work that goes into those numbers. I think they're important numbers that we should collect, but I think it's the kind of information about our decisions that need to come to the board, not some of the numbers. So just to come back on that point, Anna. In terms, John, of your question to David and the detail of this, I think what we've tried to do in 2.5, I take absolutely the point about the choice of language that you're making, although I think on this report, this was one of the reports that I've asked is circulated to board members in its development, so board members are able to comment as it's being developed. So you should not be surprised by anything that's in this, because you should have had the opportunity to comment beforehand on this report, and that's my commitment on all others about how we do that. And we will use workshops and seminars as a way of actually structuring that before we get into the drafting of it as well. So I hope we can continue to do that and get the most appropriate system to get your proper engagement in that. But on this issue, 2.5 is the issue, David, that you raised about what is it that should come to the board and how that should be. And this was sparked by the decision around the Trust Special Administrator being appointed to Mid-Staffordshire, if I remember correctly, our last meeting. Sorry, 2.6. So 2.6 is proposing that responding to that Special Administrator request from Monitor is something that be delegated from you to me. My commitment is I would do that with you, but we'd do that within the intervals between board meetings, because I think that's the speed that some of this will go at, and that's what we were attempting to say into 2.6, and to get that. And I think this is me, not just as Chief Executive, but as a board member as well, to get that, and I hope that was the attempt to do that. You come back whether that works.
I just feel that the danger is that we lose sort of common sense.
Okay.
And I don't want to be in a position in 6 months' time when something important has happened, and we say, well, why didn't we know about it? And someone says, oh, well, it's in section 16.1 on page 280. You know what I mean?
I will not do that.
I know, but sometime in the future that might happen. I just would like to feel that there was some common sense in here as well. It overrode things, you know. I mean, I feel completely happy that you will raise with me anything that's important. But I mean, I am just very conscious of the fact that just looking backwards, you know, this organisation has had a scheme of delegation which effectively kept important things away from coming to the board. And I mean, you know, so that's my concern.
Okay, well, maybe...
Malcolm?
I don't know if it addresses the point of common sense or not, but the message, I mean, I'm, from an operational perspective, very pleased with the revisions to the scheme of delegation as in relation to regulatory decisions. The broad message I've given in my region is, if in doubt, escalate. If in doubt, pick up the phone. You know, don't stick to the narrow black letter of this scheme of delegation or the existing scheme of delegation. If you think... and I used to call it shades of grey. Can't really say that anymore. But if you know, the bigger decisions, we're dealing with shades of grey. It's not black or white. If you're not sure, pick up the telephone to the next person in the line, and whether it's delegated to a head of regional compliance, to a DDO, to Amanda, or not, I would always bring up the complicated things for a further review and discussion at the appropriate level. So that to me is the common sense overlay to all of this. If in doubt, escalate.
Yeah.
Can I come back, David? Because I think so I want to focus our attention on the covering paper here, which and on the principles. So regulatory decisions reserved to the board for decision 24, 25 and 26. And I think the problem is that what we don't have here is something which makes it clear that some regulatory just ordinary regulatory decisions are of such an enormity for a variety of possible reasons, which we probably need to kind of give some exposure to, that actually your escalation locally should come all the way up. And what this doesn't allow for is that those decisions might end up at the board. And it seems to me we need to have that in here. There's the possibility that the escalation process doesn't stop with the executive; it stops with the board, and that isn't in here. Now, obviously, that creates some fuzziness for staff because it's not a clear delegation. It's not saying you can make all these decisions. It's saying actually some of them are so important, and then we have to stop and think, well, and what is so important look like? You know, this question of judgment, and you can't always describe it, but you can give some in perfect detail. There are no, rules don't apply here, but there is some sense of I'm sure we could elaborate, which would describe the kind of dimensions of importance that you would need to consider. But I think that's what's missing.
Yeah. See, I think, Malcolm, on your point, that if the worry list of hospitals had come to the board, had always come to the board, we would have been asking here some quite penetrating questions about, which ones should we be really worried about, and that discussion has never happened at this level. And that's what concerns me about where we've been in the past, that actually we have been blinded from what is really important in what we're doing, because it was regarded as being operational. It's not operational, it's completely our whole core purpose. And I don't want this board to be in a position where what we think is really important has no visibility at this level, and somehow people have felt, well, we shouldn't ask about that because it's like operational. Well, actually, it's much more than that. I mean, that's my concern about just signing off something like this when I don't really know whether it answers that question.
So, David, I wonder if I can help on that. Sorry, Steve, do you want to go?
Well, I mean, I think the issue for the board, I think, is a question of having confidence in the executive team. And I think if we don't have that, no system of delegation is going to be workable anyway. And so it's really important that actually some of the structural changes, some of the new organisation is really put in place, and we test it and we develop those relationships.
Well, and vice versa.
And vice versa.
They've got to have confidence in the board.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's a two-way thing.
Indeed. But we are not experts in this field. And we will expect the executive officers to advise us, to make recommendations that we then test. And some of that process is very discursive. And sometimes there are decisions going to have to be made in a very short space of time. And I think all of those in any organisation I've been involved in depend on a very strong relationship between the chief executive and the chair.
Yeah.
And we've got every indication that is developing really, really well. I think.
You don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that I want more information here because I don't trust David and his team to deal with it. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that these decisions about hospitals and care homes and care groups are really important. That's why we're here, and therefore, and it is a judgment. It's not just being an expert about MRSA levels or something. It is a judgment, and I think. I don't want us to be out of that judgment. That's all I'm saying. Now, I think the direction of travel on this is right. Yes. But to John's question, do I know that my concern is being addressed? I don't really know that it is being addressed. And I'd like you to come back maybe at the next meeting, David, as you've read all 211 pages of it in huge. And I think you have an understanding of this, which is much deeper than mine. To giving me your view, or giving us your views as to what this means in practice.
Thank you, Chair.
Now that is delegation.
Yeah. No, I've got the message. I think there's two things to unpick from this. One is, but before I say that, so what we've tried to do, Anna, to your point, and I think this is something that I'd ask other board members to think about. And I think we've tried to capture this in 210 and 211. And as a regulator, some of the decisions that we make as an organisation, this is CQC as a whole, are appealable. And therefore, if you make the decision as a board, the issue then is raised is where does that appeal go to? So one of the considerations we've had to give to this is how do you sequence in the entitlement that organisations have got to appeal any decision that we make, which ultimately can go to the tribunal for that judgment. So we've tried to set the level of delegations operationally, and I take the issue about culture and tradition and whether people have felt frustrated by that. And I just, if I can just put that on one side for a second, is actually just try and create a decision-making process which allows us appropriate decisions to be made with the volume of decisions we've got to make. But that, I'm not trying then to reduce every decision to the level of all 44,000, because clearly some have more resonance for a greater proportion of people than others. I'm not saying one is more important than the other, but greater resonance because it touches more people. So I just make that distinction about we do need in our decision making to build in the headroom for appeal. And what we were trying to do in 211 was do exactly that. Now, I think to the point that's being discussed about the confidence whether the issues that are being considered operationally are actually coming to the board in real time to allow the board to engage with those and to shape and influence how we as an organisation in the name of CQC are actually taking that work forward, then I wonder whether that's an issue about decision making as it is about early discussion about the issues as those decisions are being taken in real time. And therefore, what I'll take away, David, is let's look again at the language to make sure we've got the appropriate decision making and we've got that headroom in that allows appeal to actually be built into our decisions. We'll pick up the common sense bit, David, about that, and if I may suggest that what we'll do is bring forward a report which proposes how we should report those key issues of significance and find a way of actually drawing those to the attention of the board. And I think that will be a mixture of things that we do in between board meetings, because that's the rhythm that these are going to operate at, and actually what perhaps either in a chief executive's report or in a performance report we can pull out about those high-level important decisions that are being made. I don't know whether that would work.
That's neatly kicking it into, well, not long grass, but into sort of half-cut grass till the next meeting anyway. If you could come back on that, if you can. Do you mind doing that?
No.
Quick, yeah.
Just very quickly, just to say that some other regulators handle that question of appeals by having an independent regulatory appeals decision committee, and that is an option that we could adopt if we were so minded.
Okay, thanks.
It is.
Okay. Thanks very much. Alistair, I know a lot of work's gone into this report, and I don't mean to be sort of critical of that. I just don't feel totally comfortable with it at the moment, that's all. Okay. Right, thank you. John, quick feedback on the ARAC committee of yesterday?
Yes, ARAC met yesterday, and therefore I apologise for the fact that we haven't managed to construct a written report to lay around the table, so you'll have to excuse me while I just quickly go through what we discussed. We discussed, first of all, the progress towards the 2012-2013 annual report, and in particular the Statement of Corporate Governance. And this will be coming to our meeting on the 30th of April to be finalised, and then we will recommend it to the board, and it is then for the board to adopt that along with the rest of the annual report if it wishes. We considered the volume of the work which has been undertaken to quantify the costs of CQC's corporate governance, and I can assure you that it is significantly less than the 2% standard benchmark which is applied to organisations like ours. On risk, we discussed a number of issues which you've already had a little bit of flavour of. We received a report from David Bean on emerging risks. We received a report from the chair of the Regulatory Risk Committee, which is an executive level committee, which was helpful, but also indicated that there's likely to be further structural changes inside the executive structure of the Commission, which will mean that that committee will be phased out over time. We welcomed the much greater analysis of data and volume of data that there is about the quality of what is found through the inspection regime. We welcomed that, but did commend that to David Bean as worthy of further or needing further development, and in particular that it should be used in order to construct the inspection programme, deploy resources, and link in with the core business of inspecting and forming judgments about the quality of care across the sector. We approved the Risk Management and Assurance Policy Statement, which is a revision of a previous document. And while we approved it, we nevertheless expressed concern that there is still a major task to be undertaken in order to ensure that there is full understanding and implementation in the executive structure of that policy. Turning briefly to audit, we reviewed 2 completed audit reports and noted them. We note that the 2012-2013 audit programme will be completed, but there will be a little slippage which will push it in to the next financial year. And finally, we remain concerned about the extent to which the recommendations for management action arising from audit reports are still not being implemented as speedily as would be desirable, although we do acknowledge that the number of overdue actions is declining quite considerably since we first started expressing concern about this last year. So some progress has been made, but we still need to report to you our concern about those overdue actions. And finally, I think we spent quite a long time trying to make sure that we were supporting the Chief Executive and the executive team in the very important developments that they're making to the processes, the approach, and the structure inside the executive structure of the Commission, in order to ensure that that is implemented as speedily as we can help to secure. I think that probably sums it up, David, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, John. Any questions for John? David, do you want any feedback to John?
No, I thought that was absolutely accurate. And just to reiterate the point that I think the strategic risk register needs to be presented as part of the business plan when that comes for final approval, and I think that begins to draw together the work of ARAC and the work of the board in terms of how we move forward.
Okay, good. Any other business for the public part of the meeting? No? Excellent. Well, I think we'll close the public part of the meeting now and have a cup of coffee and then gather back in 15 minutes. Thank you.